The reason why I said it was a very good bridge between what Paul said and what I'm about to say, no. I will want that. Is because the empire controls through divide and conquer. What we're discovering now, arising with the BRICS through the leadership of China, and especially the China-Russia-India nexus, is that the new paradigm that's defining their mode of internal and foreign policy is based on an approach of a harmony of interests. Right? The idea of a win-win.
Win-win situation.
Exactly. And this is what's really freaking out a lot of the imperialists that have been controlling the different mechanisms of our geopolitical society for the past century. And up until now, it's largely been understood only by a few that the means by which we communicate across cultures, across languages, and get above our empirical, physical differences, which is cultural, this person different religion than me, they speak different language than me, they speak different, they worship different name God than I do. We have to fight. That's what the British have been inflaming for many, many centuries. The reason why, the way we get over this is through the universal language of both science and music.
That's right.
Because no matter what language you are, no matter what culture you are, you can discover that we're made of atoms, you can discover that we're in a galaxy, and you can discover its principles and apply them for the benefit of your people if you're being creative. If you're not following any formulas that tell you you have to think this way and you can't break out of those formulas, if you don't believe that, and you're wise enough to know your material, but you have the creative spirit enough to think outside the box, you can discover laws of the universe and translate that back in ways that are both beautiful, that have expression in arts, have expression in science, and that's the technological improvement that allows us to have 7 billion people on the Earth. And the oligarchy has been doing a lot of propaganda, as Paul went through, to get people to believe that the fact that we have 7 billion people on the Earth that can live much longer than we could have 3,000, 4,000 years ago in general, that's a sign that we're a virus. Most people would say, oh yeah, of course we're 7 billion people on the Earth. That's a sign why we're a virus. Don't you know that? No. What they're missing is that that is a shadow of a principle. The principle is not something you could see because that is the driver of what defines us as a human and not a monkey. Physically, we're not that different. The DNA-wise is not that different. If you're going to try to make a materialist case for why we're different than animals, you won't go very far. Right? We got a bigger prefrontal cortex, so we can lie better. Right? We play better video games because we have multiple thumbs. But if you get beyond that to a deeper species characteristic that we are able to discover how we think and think better about after having discovered that one assumption that we had was wrong and replace it with a better hypothesis that allows us to resolve paradoxes and translate that back to doing good for ourselves and our fellow man and find happiness in that process. If you can define human beings as that, the oligarchy, no oligarchy, whether it's Asian or European or whatever its flavor, will ever be able to sink its tentacles into human society. And the fact that Paul brought up the question of culture, he brought up this very important personality who you guys all have some disgusting literature in front of you named Bertrand Russell. And I'm assuming before people got here, did they already have an idea of who Bertrand Russell was? So? Yeah? Okay. Mr. LaRouche, the gentleman we work with, was a 93-year-old physical economist, a candidate for the presidency of the American Republic on 8 occasions, and an advisor to international governments, has made the point on a number of occasions, which people find very troubling, that Bertrand Russell is the most qualifies as being the most evil man of the 20th century, which is controversial because, as Paul went through, this is the big peacemaker. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's the guy who fought throughout the 60s to create the anti-nuclear movement, right? To ban the bomb and all of these things. So how the hell is a guy who's apparently a logician?
For literature, do you know the book? It was a special book for the entire activity.
I'll get back to you on that one. He did write prolifically. But Bertrand Russell's ghost doesn't just infest our society in the form of a fear of thermonuclear annihilation, being it that he was one of the co-architects of the mutually assured destruction doctrine. It goes deeper than that as well. That's one important aspect. And I'm going to touch in my presentation on another aspect, and I'm going to do it in a way that utilizes the writings of a certain scientist and a philosopher and a musician named Max Planck. Before I do that, though, I want to start with a quick anecdote because, and this is going to get at how the ghost of Bertrand Russell's mind still infects and controls and distorts our society today. Christine and myself were at a little while ago. We were at a conference called Africa 2063. It's one of these conferences in Ottawa held by the public servant, or the government of Canada. On what should Africa do to stop being so bad, right? And you go to this thing, and there's certainly a few African diplomats there, but generally the whole thing is controlled by a bunch of detached white bureaucrats talking as experts about what Africa should do to be more behaved.
Asking me, I will let you know, because soon I'm going to run for president. Less than
Okay. Well, see, here's the thing. What they started doing is they started pulling up a bunch of statistical graphs and stats and index charts pointing out, first they had a corruption index chart of the world, going through all of the most corrupt nations. Of course, Africa, all the Russia, China, very corrupt in the index chart of corruption. Canada, #1, not corrupt, 100% no corruption, right? Great Britain, no corruption. And of course, they're giving these charts as a way to somehow they're mathematical, entirely mathematical, right? As if you could measure corruption or inequality by a mathematical metric, as if that were possible, but they do it anyway. And then they use that as a way to morally say, this is why we can tell them how much carbon they have to reduce, how much they have to obey to international standards of good governance. Now, I don't know if they've ever looked at what exactly Harper does in the back rooms or what the Privy Council does in Canada, but I think that would change their charts a little bit. A professor gets up afterwards, who's from Nigeria, and he begins his presentation by saying, I'm going to be declaring war on mathematics. He's being provocative. He's not saying he hates mathematics. He gives an anecdote of one of his invitations to participate in a World Bank summit meeting. Or a World Bank meeting on African culture. He was supposed to be a representative to speak as an authority on African culture. And he said, as soon as I got there, I saw a bunch of IMF, World Bank economists all sitting together talking about Africa, and I knew it was going to be bad news. And they started pulling up their charts, and they started making an excuse, or making arguments, very mathematical, logical arguments, that Africa is doing really great. Its business is up, the markets are up, if you would just look at the map, you'd think, well, there must be a renaissance. Things are so monetarily good based on the data sets that they're presenting. And it got me thinking in a discussion with him afterwards, we were playing with this irony that in our society, we pride ourselves in the West of having produced more PhDs per capita than in any other moment in our past. And yet, with all of those PhDs being pumped out of our society, out of our universities, the collapse of our civilization is happening at a faster and faster rate. Paradox. If the purpose of education is supposed to equip people with the mental capacities to solve problems, why the hell are we only making problems worse and worse? And it seems good people who seem to be, they kiss their child bed at night, they read them stories, they're a good neighbor, good father, good mother. Yet these people, as soon as they become PhDs and work for the World Bank, work as economists in most of the institutions, they seem to have a complete disconnect that the theories, the ivory tower formulas that they apply, kill millions, if not billions of people. There's a total disconnect between the theory, this abstract system of formula, and reality. There is generally not a very good connection. How is that the case? What are we doing wrong? And this is where the question of Bertrand Russell becomes very interesting from another angle. Because yes, as you recapitulated, mutually assured destruction, society of fear, divide to conquer, a balance of powers, that's been the last 60, 70 years, right? A total balance of terror. From the Soviets, from the Americans, the capitalists, you had the capitalist liberal extreme on the one side that was supposed to define one extreme in polarity versus the totalitarian Soviet regime states of the world. And that balance of terror was the defining thing. Now, Lyndon LaRouche makes a point, and this is going to get at Bertrand Russell, that in order to figure out how he was able to make his long-term forecast successfully over the past 4 decades is because he rejected mathematical, statistical approaches to economic analysis. His first step, and he's been trying to say this to everybody, saying it's not just me, I don't have special powers, I just use common sense and recognize that these are not reliable metrics of value when you're charting economic health or the future of a system. You can't use mathematical, statistical methods of analysis. You can't do that. And he said, because I rejected that, I was free to start looking for what are more valid physical scientific parameters defining the boundary conditions of the system, which we are, as a 7 billion of our species on the Earth. We are a system. What are the physical parameters defining our potential to reproduce ourselves as a species successfully into the future? Right? Are we producing more food? Okay, if so, then the increase of money supply in the system is probably justified. If you're finding that your food production and the means of production as a whole are actually being reduced over time per capita, while by some miracle your monetary abundance is increasing, you're doing something wrong. Right? If the physical means that you have to produce enough to sustain, and a little bit more, your system, your society, if that is being destroyed by any logical argument, while your monetary flows are increasing, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, you could smell out a lie, but you could only smell it if you got an internal metric standard of value. And that's the thing, it's not a question of some logical argument beating out some other logical argument. It's a question, do you have an internal moral standard of value that you use to govern your analysis that will allow you an insight into knowing where is society going to break down, where is the destruction happening, where are the wars coming at us, and how do you change that? How do you intervene through an act of will of mind to change those parameters, right? If you don't see that, if you were just looking at the future in any other way, by just extrapolating what came yesterday, what came the day before yesterday, okay, well, there was no collapse yesterday, there's no collapse last week, there's no collapse last month. I guess if I just continue to linearly extrapolate that into my idea, my abstract idea of what the future is, sure, there won't be a collapse. And I can talk about what is the world going to be like in 40 years. It's going to be just a slow, little bit, worse version of what we have today. It's a slow, gradual, bleh. Maybe at some point, the machines will fight us at some point. But people's idea of the future is really fucked up because they don't have this scientific idea of value. And this is what LaRouche has been saying for a long time, since he started this organization, that people really need to think more deeply about the meaning of science. And I'm not going to go into any serious detail. I'm not going to try to resolve any problems about the quantum or anything when I'm bringing up Max Planck. I'm just going to be introducing Max Planck's method of thinking, some of the warnings that he had laid out for present scientists and future ones in his day. But to begin with a quick statement by LaRouche from a paper of last year called Mind Over Your Matter. Very fun paper. He writes, Kevin, you want to read that?
Science must be reconsidered as being, in principle, the yet-to-be-discovered of the hitherto unknown advances into the domain of the higher principles of knowable truth. As great talents such as Bernard Riemann, Max Planck, and Albert Einstein appreciated the principle of science prior to the travesties unleashed since the outburst of the celebration of the advent of the 20th century, such as the moral and pseudoscientific travesties typified by the advent of such monsters as Bertrand Russell.
Strong words. So, one of the elements that LaRouche has been putting forth for decades is that we need to study the original writings of people who made discoveries. Don't necessarily dwell on encyclopedia entries or people who act like they know about things and write about and interpret what some real scientific discoverer made as a discovery. Just go straight to the source. Just get a sense of how they're actually thinking. They're going to tell you how they're thinking. And you're going to find that in doing so, you're going to find that most of the expert opinion about most scientific discoveries that are believed in our society are actually bullshit. Whether knowingly or whether, as we're going to discover, or whether unknowingly or whether knowingly, that would be the case. And Bertrand Russell will play a very big role in this, as LaRouche made a point of calling him a pseudoscientific travesty and a monster for reasons that are more than just directly political in nature. Now, Bertrand Russell, on top of his disgusting political views on how the society should organize itself, and that was put into practice, working through the leading governing circles of the Fabian Society, the highest governing faculties of Cambridge, Russell produced several works on how society needs to be organized to have a balance and a harmony under a good, healthy, oligarchical system, where people just didn't really get too uppity. One of these books is called Impact of Science in Society in 1951, where Bertrand Russell, and this is one of a number of, it's very difficult to quote Bertrand Russell when you want to get across how sick this guy is, because almost every page does something sicker than the page before. This one is, I think, very indicative of the type of thinking that shapes our current society, where he writes, "The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless the indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for its centricity. But I anticipate. It is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray." Got a bit of a sick sense of humor there. 20 years earlier, he wrote another book on the science of society, where he got this in another fashion. It was so bawling that I had to just read this. "The scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power." This is 1930. "Ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. All boys and girls will learn from an early age to be what is called cooperative, i.e., to do exactly what everybody else is doing. Popular opinion. Initiative will be discouraged in these children, and insubordination, without being punished, will be scientifically trained out of them. Except for the one matter of loyalty to the world state and to their own order, members of the governing class will be encouraged to be adventurous and full of initiative. It will be recognized that it is their business to improve scientific technique and to keep the manual workers contented by means of continual new amusements."
Sorry, Matt.
Yeah,
Do you remember what book this is from?
I will give you that. There's a PDF of that I can send you. So the question is, how do you get society to fall for that? When you're in a world, this is 1930, you're still at a moment where you have great scientists who had made a giant scientific revolution throughout the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. People like Max Planck, Einstein, the Curie family, the daughter, the son-in-law. But you had a whole culture of scientific optimism that had been given new breath and new life based on the discoveries and the density of new principles that were discovered in the end of the 19th century and to the beginning of this period. So people were still in a state where they weren't of the view like they are today that scientific and technological progress is just bad. It's just intrinsically us changing nature for the worse and thus killing nature as a virus that we are. They didn't believe that then. That was not the general governing ethic. So how would you get people who actually don't believe that that truth should be only allowed for a small clique, right, to control scientific power under conditions, to allow for a template like that to be put into action? So this is where I mentioned you Nobel Prize. History of Western Philosophy. So two of the most influential books, there are a few others that Bertrand Russell himself wrote, involved part of what gets at the essence of how this operation works. Basically, they rewrote Western civilization, on one hand, in a way, with an angle that would allow for the justification for an imperial system, on the one hand. This is literally read as a mandatory reading in every philosophy program in the Western world. The Priest thing is also in Asia. It has penetrated too. This is literally, when I say the most widely read philosophy book, that's it, where he just redefines all of the Western thinkers from Plato all the way to the present, removing something very important from the mix, without which that ingredient you would not understand how the hell do you beat an oligarchy, how do you join the BRICS, right? If you don't have this understanding of what governed the real creative leaps of our understanding of the nature of the universe and its application to political freedom for the past several thousand years, since the time of Solon of Athens and before. If you don't have that understanding of what Plato did and what the Renaissance was all about, and you believe what Bertrand Russell writes about logic, that everything is about yes, right and wrong, yes or no, this binary, that's Western civilization. It's right and wrong, black and white. So we obviously have to get out of that idea. If you believe that, you will not understand how we should join the BRICS. You will not understand what the principle of the BRICS is, which is a revival of something which America was based upon. And Americans themselves don't even know this. It's something that Canadians also have to realize, because we failed to take advantage of this opportunity in our historical traditions when it was presented to us to join up and become an independent nation. We failed on various occasions. That's an important part of our history. If you read Bertrand Russell, you won't know that. The second thing, what was written before, you guys heard about the Principia Mathematica? Yeah? So, this is 1910? Principia Mathematica was produced? So, what he's doing with this is reducing all of knowledge to a state where we can define truth as mathematical certainty. That unless you can describe with mathematical certainty a process where both sides of the equation balance out, if you can't do that, you don't know truth. Truth is not. Truth is only by reducing any physical process that you can observe to some state of math. Another aspect of this was saying that because you can use a reductionist way to break things apart. Let's say you're looking at a bird, you want to figure out what makes life, what makes the bird tick. Reductionism, which is what Bertrand Russell is basically advocating, is that you have to see the bird as the sum of parts, and if you want to get at what makes it tick, you got to start breaking it apart. Because the parts, these little parts make up, the cells make up the bird. So what makes the cells move? Well, get down there, start pulling them apart. And at a certain point, you start collecting the bird apart, and you've forgotten that you've killed the bird. You actually don't know what makes it tick. So the idea that the whole is simply the sum of its parts is a fundamental aspect of what Bertrand Russell was trying to advocate as being the way that we have to think scientifically. And based on that, we can start creating deductive and inductive reasoning that would allow us to evaluate what a system is. Right. You guys heard of deductive, inductive? Two choices, right? Two paths to truth. You could either start with the parts, look for patterns. So the sun raised yesterday, the sun raised the day before. Thus, it's going to raise forever on 24-hour cycles. Right? You take some experience and you make it universal out of it. Or you can do something by starting from an assumption that, pick an assumption, all people are monkeys, okay? The world is full of people, and thus the world is full of monkeys. Or the idea that, better yet, a better way of saying that, people are monkeys. Monkeys have no ability to have more than 20 million of their species. Thus, there's 7 billion people, so we should only have 20 million of our species. Right? That's the type of very naive reasoning where you start with a universal rule, and then you try to find that, okay, there's some specificities, and I'm going to try to figure out their nature by looking at the rule that I set up.
It was like 3 logical fallacies in one.
And yet, that's the type of thing you get when you talk to a World Bank economists. Greece has to pay their debt. Yeah, but they're going to die if they pay their debt. Yeah, but their debt has to be paid.
Yeah, but they must die because of viruses.
The debt is sacred, life is not. So, what you're lacking here is a sense of just basic, there's something that you're missing. Point is, there's not just two paths to knowledge. And this is what we're getting at, this is what Max Planck will be getting at. And the consequence of thinking in these terms, of trying to find everything with absolute mathematical certainty, will result in a conclusion that there is no causality. That causality itself is naivety. When Bertrand Russell made his life's work basically trying to refute the idea of cause by first defining what science is. And by misdefining it, he was able to say, well, thus there is no cause. Where he literally wrote, and this is in 1912, to me it seems that philosophy ought not to assume such legislative functions, and that the reason why physics has ceased to look for causes is that, in fact, there are no such things. The law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. Now, think about this, right? In whose advantage would it be for society to think this way? Because who's putting it into motion? Who's causing the political process that people are living in to change in a way which is destroying their own ability to survive and perpetuate their species through the use of the nuclear bomb in certain game theory ways? Who's putting this process in motion? Who's causing the process to come into being that's creating a culture of fear, of paranoia? The same people are trying to tell you there's no cause. Oh yeah, of course the arsonist will tell you there's no way lighting fires. Ignore those fires. It's okay. So, the irony of what Russell is doing, and he's speaking to the indeterminists, the new school that had just really started flourishing of the people who rejected the naive classical mechanistic view of causality. They rejected that. They were that smart to say, okay, well, the idea that mechanical formulas absolutely determine creation, that's wrong. Okay, so but rather than trying to find, well, what non-mechanistic approach to looking at what's shaping the universe that we observe, rather than looking for a better version of it, or a better approach to it, they simply became indeterminists. They stopped believing in any form of determination, of any form of causation, and that's what Bertrand Russell is speaking to. This is ironic because in this period of 1912, again, you're having the blossoming of a whole new epoch in human knowledge. All of the former boundary conditions of what our idea of what's the smallest we can go, what's the universe of that we can relate to conceptually and also physically, those boundary conditions had completely been blown apart, both in the small, right? When Max Planck came out with his discovery of a certain type of that energy has a certain quantized state to it, that when you go down to the very small, there's a certain limit to, well, basically how small you can break things down on a certain level. So light both has a certain wave-like quality, it has a certain particle-like energy, it also has a certain quality of an energy packet. It's not just purely an energetic wave. So we discovered that there was this certain boundary condition on the small that gave us a new ability to do experimental physics and make more discoveries. But on the large, his friend and fellow musician, not a coincidence, Albert Einstein, was setting whole new boundary conditions for what are new constants that would allow us to evaluate the process that we could observe of the universe. So these were things that were completely overthrowing former dogmas that were held as sacred cows, the idea of absolute space, the action at a distance of Newton, the idea that you had Euclidean space of just X, Y, Z charts, and that you have these parallel lines going forever as parallel lines into infinity. All of these things were overthrown with these discoveries. And the idea that matter as a whole actually contained within it more energy potential than anything known hitherto. These were overthrowing everything that Bertrand Russell was saying we had to deduce all of knowledge into a set of axioms and a set of, that's basically the idea of trying to reduce everything to formulas, is you have to reduce everything to a set of logical propositions that everyone believes are true.
Where's Schrödinger fit into that?
He comes in a bit later as a buddy of Einstein and demonstrates that, I didn't read his proof because I'm not a mathematician, but he basically comes in and demonstrates that there's a fallacy in Bertrand Russell's Principia by demonstrating something to the effect of that it only works in describing objective processes. Anything that doesn't actually refer to itself, it's consistent, but as soon as it refers to itself, effectively, it breaks down. And I mean, Dr. Hussein could probably say a lot more than that than I can.
My question is,
Yeah.
how influential Bertrand Russell was?
How
Because how influential
How influential was he?
Basically,
Okay.
while he was producing that book, quantum mechanics was developing,
Yeah.
special relativity and general relativity was developing, and
Yeah.
you really were going completely against these
I
ideas.
know, yeah.
Quantum mechanics is no determination of quantum
No,
mechanics.
yeah, that's right.
Everything is probability.
Yeah.
While Einstein used the causality to prove that the speed of light has to be constant.
Yeah.
It's basically because of the causality that the speed of light has to be constant, nothing else, although it was proven experimentally at the
Yeah.
time. But the idea Einstein came up with it because of it, against causality, that light cannot move faster than that particular speed. So really, all his ideas never really influenced anyone.
Well, you're going to find that when you go into the school of cybernetics, systems analysis, even the Copenhagen school, people like Niels Bohr were highly influenced by Russell directly, Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, the game theoreticians, Morgenstern. All of these folks were deeply, deeply influenced directly by Russell's work because what they were refuting in terms of classical mechanics was the Russell interpretation. They were not actually dealing with what Einstein, what I'm going to read from Max Planck's writings. What I'm going to read is going to demonstrate a little bit about what Einstein and Planck were actually doing with their sense of what knowledge and causality was, which is different from what Russell said it was. I don't want that to sound too esoteric right now, but it's going to make more sense as we read some Planck.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
you start at UBC, and there's like part of the philosophy program, you have to take sequential logic first.
Yeah, and look, Russell himself never believed what he said was true. It's like Adam Smith. He didn't himself believe in his own doctrines. It was that Adam Smith worked for the British East India Company and had to produce a treatise to justify bringing America back under the fold of the mother. And that was based on, again, these guys don't necessarily believe what they're saying. That's always it when you get to the higher echelons of those who are engaged in producing theoretical works to justify empire.
I think that was also in the infancy when his writings were really getting going. Now you're seeing the results of it. Russell's.
Right.
At the time when general relativity and theory of relativity, like Einstein's work was a lot more popular, and him and his class of thinkers were obviously a lot more free to espouse their ideas and not face much opposition. Now it's kind of like the Green Movement. The Green Movement started out in infancy without much power. Now they've completely co-opted all the environmental movements and they've turned them upside down and inside
That's
out.
Russell. See, this is Russell.
That's Russell, exactly.
Yeah, well,
But I want to get on with
isn't Rome BOHM?
Yeah.
Isn't he enjoying sort of rehabilitation in part because of quantum information theory? Now that we recognize.
Let's bring that up in the discussion afterwards, because I don't want to go too off topic from the line of investigation that we're on right now, but we can revisit some of that. And Dr. Hussein, I think, could probably contribute more to that part of the discussion than I can. But one of the aspects that was coming through here was that, as part of the classical system, you had to be able to always measure whether it was a planet or something in motion, both its position and its velocity. And the fact that when you got into the quantum world and you started looking at electrons or you started looking at photons, you couldn't do it anymore, right? And we all know the story. As soon as you try to get down enough to as soon as you try to observe a photon or an electron in motion, if you want greater definition of where its position is, then you got to use a smaller wavelength, which causes it to move more than if you had less definition of where it was. You use a wider wavelength and you have a less idea. But the point is, as soon as you observe it, it gets hit by a light or like a light wave and has to jump back to your field of perception, and then you can make a judgment of where it is. As soon as you do that, you move it, you change it. So you can't, that doesn't happen with a planet. You see a planet, the light wave hits the planet, it comes back at you, you chart where it is, all is well and good about its velocity and position. It doesn't work on the small. So, while you had the statistical mechanists saying, or the new statisticians, the indeterminists saying, that's a proof that there is no causality. You can't get all of the facts with mathematical certainty, there's no causality. You can only get, at best, maybe some probability, and try to refine probability. Max Planck and Einstein are treated like crazy old quacks today. You guys notice that these guys are the ones who didn't get the new doctrine. They just were holding on to the old theory that there was causality, and that's why they were crooks, not respected by the real scientific community in their age.
No, I'm sorry. In Europe, Max Planck is a God-proof physicians. I don't know what they are saying,
Well, this is something I was told a lot, and I've got a lot of other people who have experienced this too, that they're, I don't know, has anyone heard this, that Einstein was a crazy quack who couldn't accept the new paradigm?
I don't know about
This is the first time that I'm
Max
saying this
Planck
here.
is the father of new theories, so he is the basic.
He was at war the whole time, though, with the new breed of statisticians to try to get them to realize that there's something that they're missing out on.
Isn't that where the famous quote Einstein says is, God is opposed to that?
Yeah, that's one aspect of it.
It was string theory that came immediately after.
That came much later.
But it challenged Einstein. I don't know if that's part of it.
That's as far as I've understood, that seems to be based on a really bad interpretation of physics. As far as I understand it, I don't know, there might be something legitimate there, but in terms of what Einstein and Planck and Kepler before them were doing, it seems like there is something that's missing. Planck fights back, and I'm going to try to run through this relatively quickly because this I know is a meaty topic, but it's important. It's important because we are at a paradigm shift in human civilization, and we should be able to get a little bit deeper past the surface of things to see what's behind the ideas shaping our world and our future. So it's worth the time. I'm using most of the writings. There's about 6 small quotes taken from the Philosophy of Physics by Max Planck in 1938, and another work that he wrote called The Universe in the Light of Modern Physics, which I highly recommend reading. They're both very, very readable essays. But Max Planck makes the point that the reason why the measurements of atomic physics are inexact need not necessarily be looked for in any failure of causality. It may equally well consist in the formulation of faulty concepts, and hence of inappropriate questions. Okay? So you're saying maybe our concepts and the questions that we're posing are more the problem. It's maybe not causality which is the problem. There might be something else about how we're looking at it. So how does he do that? What does he mean? He gives an example, a quick example. Somebody want to read?
No, go ahead.
We're flopping around.
You continue. You're a good reader.
Okay. So let us take 2 numbers which are practically equal in magnitude. This is Max Planck. One of them being the square root of 2, and the other 1.4142, blah, blah, blah. The former figure is a few billionths greater than the latter, and in every numerical calculation in physics or in astronomy, the 2 numbers can be treated as identical. So they're the same thing, right? Square root of 2.
Well, I could speculate, but I'm not sure everyone would agree with me.
Sure.
Basically, the way me and my friends regard causality is that it's an emergent property from the unit membrane of the universe. As you get quantum fluctuations that overlap, not just the board, but the coalescent effect, you get patterns that are holographic projections of the underlying strata of the mechanism.
Yeah, we can have a discussion about that, but for the time being, to stick on like his line of thinking, do we see sort of what he's trying to get at between how are they different, square root of 2, and 1.14121356 to infinity? How are these, though they work the same practically in this observational astronomy or physics, he says that they're different. You guys see how he means?
Well, I guess the former is a principle. It's more conceptual. So
Square root of 2.
The square root of 2. The other one is just one way of looking at what the square root of 2 could mean if you're measuring it up to a certain number.
So how do you represent the square root of 2? If not by simply a number symbol, how do you represent it physically? Or, as you were saying, it's a principle. So what is it? How would you represent that?
How would I, as opposed to 1.1412, you mean?
Yeah,
Symbol, right?
rather than simple, these are both symbols in a sense. This is symbolic language, that's a symbol. But what would be the physical process that would, he says, origin. One is classed as the origin, and the other is simply magnitude. Would you be able to discover this
No.
if you didn't first have an idea of something of a quality first? Where does that, right? Would this number ever come about if there wasn't some first idea? No, wait, what would come first? This would come first, right?
Yeah.
What is that a symbol of, or what is that a shadow of? What's happening physically when you see a square root of 2? What do you say?
Well, it's a square.
It's a square. It's a square. Exactly. Yeah, not a trick question. it's a square. And it's a square was an area of what?
2.
2, right? Okay, so you can get that. You can actually prove that by taking a square of 1 and figuring out how you double that square of 1. What do you do to the square to get a square of 2 from the square of 1? How do you double that?
Take the diagonal.
Take a diagonal, right? So you take a diagonal. You can then prove through simply acts of reason that this second square is exactly double your first square in area, right? You can prove that. Can you all prove that? Make sense? Okay? If you wanted to, you could just say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 1 half, 1 half, 1 half, 1 half. Okay, that's 2. That's an area of 2. relative to my first of 1, right? But what's the side of 1 is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. What's the side, what times what equals 2? Right? But you can't do it that way. I would not be able to ever come up with that number and figure, okay, that number times itself gives me 2. Because I'm never going to have an end to that number. So that number only exists as an idea for us because somebody had to discover that there was something as a process within the quality of the square, which existed with or without human beings. There was squares. That's something like you know, there's hexagons in the form of snow. It doesn't mean that humans made hexagons. We use them all sorts of ways, but we didn't. It's not because of us that they're there. They're already there. But there's a certain discoverable aspect of nature that we have to look at, and then we can find that there's 2 ways of expressing it. One is a shadow, and one is closer to the cause. Yeah.
Actually, the 1.141 is an approximation.
It's an approximation.
Of the square root of 2.
That's all, yeah.
Because if you take 1.41 and multiply it by itself,
Yeah.
you will not get 2.
No.
You are not going to get 2 unless you have really much larger number
It's
of
purgatory.
units.
Well, you
Purgatory.
It's you never will get exactly 2.
Exactly, yeah.
And so just stop with numbers at some point. You'll have trillions and trillions of decimal points.
How much bailout do we need before the banks are back up again? A little bit more bailout, a little bit less bailout, a little bit less, right? It's insane. It drives you crazy.
But doesn't that imply the concept of numbers?
Yes.
The concept of numbers.
Yeah, it's a tool, but it's just that. It's we invented it, we can use it, but we shouldn't start worshiping it, right? It's like money. It's a tool. We invented it. We can use it better than carrying, chickens on our back. But we shouldn't worship it. It has its place. That's not the value comes from something qualitative, right? And if you continue that process, you start getting. If you actually start continuing that process of action, you can start getting that we're actually dealing with an introduction to basic logarithms, right? Where you have a certain type of arithmetical growth happening while you have a geometrical growth happening at the same time, right? It's a basic, discovery that little kindergarten kids should be playing with in a fun way and getting a sense that they shouldn't be worshiping numbers. Now, Bertrand Russell's educational reforms don't allow that. And in good.
By the way, the new math is derivative from Bertrand Russell.
So new math is, there you go. That was what, 1960s or?
Yeah, the new, I noticed that. Julie,
So, here's what gets us at the next point that he's going to make. And to bridge that point with the next point that Planck makes, is that if you're dealing now with equality, it's a square, right? You could take your square and you could divide it in 2, right? So I can divide it in 2. I can divide it that way, or I can divide the way I just did, that way. The point is, I take my square, I can divide it, and I get like 2 things, 2 rectangles or 2 triangles, whatever. I can divide it in 2. However, the idea of square, as an idea, can you divide that into 2? As an idea. I don't mean the square itself. Physically, the physical expression of the square you can divide.
You mean is it recursive? You mean is it recursive?
I think people actually just break up the idea. Like equality, right? Like, equality is necessary for me, as an idea, to shape this and judge that 2 of the sides that I just created are equal. If I didn't have the idea of equality, I couldn't judge that those 2 sides were equal, could I? But could I break the idea of equality up into 2? Kind of an absurd question. It's sort of like it's a weird question. Can we have your justice, right?
How much does this taste?
Like it's one of these, it's a wrong question. Yeah. This is what Planck is saying about there exists a category of wrong questions, false concepts, inappropriate questions. What's the color of a painting that's smaller than the wavelength of color? Bad question. That's not me, that's Planck who used that example. Okay, so Planck gets at how, the next point he makes in his essay, that modern physics has taught us that the nature of any system cannot be discovered by dividing it into its component parts and studying each part by itself. We must keep our attention on the whole and on the interconnections between the parts. You can't assume a society is made up of a whole 7 billion hedonistic monkeys who just want pleasure and want to avoid pain, and with a hedonistic calculus, and that's called free markets. You can't just assume the whole is the sum of its impulses.
Is the error of modern medicine. who says, make an X-ray of, I don't know, a part,
Mhm.
and we know what's your problem.
Right.
Actually, it's a system, and
Yeah,
it's
sometimes
a
something going on in your head is like
failure
causing a
in
thing in your
one.
foot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that common sense, right? I couldn't say that, my adding up you are the sum total of all of your facial characteristics. And I somehow just have this like logic machine in my head that just adds them all up and equates their like distances from each other and defines that you're not Robbie and you're you. No, like you're you, I recognize you first. And babies do that too. They recognize their mom through voice, vocal holes, right? They got an identity, visual. And this is what Planck is saying. We have to hold that in mind, that our mind has that quality of needing to find a whole to make sense of a part. You can't just try to build something up from parts. You can't just try to reduce the whole to parts and assume that you know what the whole is. You got to look beyond that. And this gets at the route of identity. This gets to the next question. Since he says in dealing with the structure of any science, a reciprocal interconnection between epistemological judgments and judgments of value was found to arise, and that no science can be wholly disentangled from the personality of the scientist. That's controversial. What do you guys think he's saying there?
Observer and object. Observer and object. The observer sees what the mind preconditions him to see.
Yeah. You can't pretend that there's some absolute schism between the actual scientist who's investigating something and the discovery that he makes. You can't just pretend that there's this infinite wall of divide. Because this is what pisses people off today. Like a lot of people get very uncomfortable with that because they're saying, no. What they're saying is, no, that's your emotions, the pollution of your personal desires, tastes, all of your personal shit inside of you. That's polluting the objective criteria of pure, certain mathematical truth. That's outside of us perpetually. There's no relationship. This is chaos inside. That's order. There's no, you can't do that. Planck is saying, no, you can't, not only can you do it, but you gotta do it, because if you don't do it, you miss the point of science. Because the philosophy of the scientist is going to affect how he reads and evaluates his data, how he comes to his discoveries. But his discoveries are inevitably going to feed back on his philosophy, right? You can't escape that fact that as soon as you discover something, it's obviously going to feed back on your general philosophy of life, your epistemological base, and your values probably too, right? You're probably going to have a more refined insight, a more refined ability to judge certain qualities that you wouldn't have had if you were ignorant of the thing that you were searching. So yeah, it's just we're not always in a state where the whole universe is alive in our minds necessarily. Sometimes you're watching TV, you're watching a ball game. It's not necessarily going to be the case that that's the intersection of the objective reality and your internal one. But there are places where this does intersect, and that's the point that real scientists have to keep in mind, and not pretend that there's something that's absolutely out of them, that's separated from them. Yeah.
But this is actually a good thing, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
our modern culture tells us that it's bad to be subjective, as though subjective means hidden in our brains away from the real world. I mean, it's our interest in our human behavior that discovers the true properties of things in human use.
Yeah.
That's also because they've misdefined both subjectivity and objectivity.
Yeah.
They've misdefined and mystified at the same time.
Yeah.
Because this is where, you get the flaky, I create my own reality type thing. I'm happy
Yeah, the two
just
opposite
making my own
extremes.
world, in spite of the fact that Africa is dying, I've got an empire that's about to slaughter a bunch of the world population in nuclear war. In spite of all that, I make my own happy reality. That's where it gets crazy.
Yeah.
So you don't want to do that either. But that touches on the next point.
But that subjectivity is actually the father of invention. Because you invent things.
Well, that's the idea, right? Are you really discovering things, or what are you doing when you shape a hypothesis, and what does that tell you about the nature of your mind and the external mind that you're discovering? There's some conjunction. Because Planck gets at the next point of free will. He says, we may perhaps deal with free will. Wait, just before we read that, sorry. He actually makes a fun point with free will. We're going to read that, because the point that he makes, he says, when you're looking at when you're actually trying to look at the photon, or the electron, and you find yourself pissed off because as soon as you try to look at it, you change it. So you shouldn't be pissed off, because there's other places we see that phenomenon occurring. And he makes the point, in a really beautiful argument that the quickest, most direct way we see this phenomenon happening is in our own free will. Right? 'Cause we have will, we have desires, we have intention, but as soon as you think about your will, as soon as you think about your intentions, do they stay the same? No. New factors have been introduced, right? We may perhaps deal with free will. Looked at subjectively, the will, insofar as it looks to the future, is not causally determined. Because any cognition of the subject's will itself acts causally upon the will, so that any definitive cognition of a fixed causal nexus is out of the question. No fixed determinism. In other words, we might say that looked at from the outside, objectively, the will is causally determined, and that looked at from the inside, subjectively, is free. Is free. The necessity of external laws doesn't mean you don't have freedom of the will. That's not a real conclusion you want to draw, but that's been a historical, for thousands of years, that's been the thing, right? If we live in a world of law that has laws, then how can we allow the existence of creative freedom, of spontaneity? How could they coexist? Right? That's a big problem for a lot of people. That goes back all the way to the Parmenides dialogue with Plato.
And then why did the elites allow for the concept of the emergence of order from chaos to arise?
Possibly because they had something to do with its creation.
Possibly because what?
They had something to do with its creation. The idea that order organizes itself out of chaos. That out of chaos comes order. Yeah, that without ideas, planned concepts that deal with what Planck is getting at, without that, you can somehow mysteriously have this zeitgeist-like reorganization of utopia, solution coming from just breaking down the corrupt system, that it just breaks down. You got that V for Vendetta anarchy moment, right, where everything just goes to anarchy, like just chaos. And then maybe, somehow, a just world order will emerge spontaneously out of that chaos.
But there's no determinism implicit in that. It can go in many different directions.
The point is it's irrational. You don't know which direction it's going to go, nor can you know. It's outside of knowledge.
So if
It's
it's
kind of
outside
random.
knowledge, then how would the elites know which way things will get steered?
They don't. That's why they're out of control. Everything's happening off script right now.
So they created a machine without knowing what they did.
That's why Hitler tried to eat them up. Like think about the Hitler beast, right? The oligarchy created Hitler. Paradox. Hitler tried to destroy the oligarchy had to fight Hitler. Okay?
Saddam, the same thing.
Huh?
Saddam, the same thing.
Okay, but keep it on the thing, right?
Well, look at ISIS
Well,
and
I
the
was
elites too,
gonna
like
say
the
that
jihad, it's gonna just
They
go
actually
crazy.
believe their own bullshit.
Well, that,
They
yeah.
believe, they have
Bingo.
been feeding themselves with shit for so long.
So what you're saying is they're clinically insane.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
You're not doing
Pretty
pure
much.
logic.
Yeah. Well, there's another disconnect there too. Russell isn't a Russellite, right?
Russell is
Russell is not a Russellite.
Russell is not
There's
a
a
Russellite.
disconnect.
That's the disconnect.
That's a huge problem because Russell didn't believe his own bullshit,
No.
right?
And he
The
actually
Russellites do.
his first work was a fantasy novel, just to get across his delusional pessimism over the nature of man in the 1880s when he's a young guy. He writes his first fantasy novel describing venomously his hate for people, his hate for scientific progress, and he plays the role of a character that ends up concluding that I have to destroy society. Right? This is as a young man just fantasizing, right? Sadly, he goes and puts it into practice.
He did a good
But
job.
he's like, look, this guy's like 8th generation oligarchy, right? His grandparents were administrators of the oligarchical system as far as Venice was concerned, of the 15th century. Right? So this is a multi-generational process of brainwashing your own progeny to carry out a certain tradition, which is so fucking immoral and unnatural that you have to train the hell out of young people to kill their natural human emotions, which is what they do in Cambridge, or All Souls, or Oxford. You don't get your local community college education there. If you get a real scholarship, you probably don't want to take that.
No, their children are educated and indoctrinated into that very style of thinking, into that belief system.
Mm-hmm. But this is where it gets kind of beautiful, because now he's saying, well, positively, okay, we know how to develop some natural tools to smell what isn't true, and maybe have a sense of like how do we approach things of the external, the subjective approach to the objective world. But what do you do now? Like, how do you find a working hypothesis? How do you create a hypothesis, a real good one? This is a good working hypothesis, is essential for any investigation. This being so, we are faced with the difficult question how we are to set about to find the most suitable hypothesis. For this, there can be no general rule. Logical thought by itself does not suffice, not even where it has an exceptionally large and manifold body of experience to aid. The only possible method consists in immediately gripping the problem or in seizing upon some happy idea. Such an intellectual leap can be executed only by a lively and independent imagination and by a strong creative power, guided by an exact knowledge of the given facts so that it follows the right path.
So in other words, he was trying to create determinism by enslaving everyone with the children of
Max Planck.
No,
Oh.
Russell.
Yes. Yeah, because Max Planck is giving you, he's giving you actually his own subjective experience. This is not just some guy writing about the theory of knowledge.
How
He's
old
actually
is
a guy
he?
who's advancing knowledge. At this point,
Yeah.
he's an old man. He's going to die in about 7 years after this writing, right after World War II. He's watched his son, he dies in sort of sad state, and yet he's still writing very positive work, battling against the whole destruction of science, but he's just watched his son executed by Hitler, because his son was part of the conspiracy to kill Hitler in '44. He was executed by the Nazis.
So he's,
Who was a fellow scientist and collaborator of Hitler.
who continues his ideas?
Well, this is the thing, that this is where things got somewhat derailed, and there have been sparks of rebirth, but overall, our job is really to try to do that. Because frankly, here, one thing I just want to read first here, this is a really good paper called Classical Music and Scientific Discovery. 2 pages, very short, from one of the more recent EIRs. No, 2013, no, not that recent. And it quotes extensively from both Einstein and Planck on their own relationship with their imagination and their discoveries. And Einstein makes the point of saying, my discovery of special relativity occurred to me by intuition, and music was the driving force behind that intuition. I am enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. By that he's defining the Bertrand Russell version of like logic knowledge. He doesn't mean the broader sense of it. Imagination encircles the world. I believe in the brotherhood of man and the uniqueness of the individual. But if you ask me to prove what I believe, I can't. You know them to be true. You could spend a whole lifetime without being able to prove them, like logically, right? The mind can proceed only so far upon what it knows and can prove. There comes a point where the mind takes a leap. Call it intuition or what you will, the mind comes upon a higher plane of knowledge, but can never prove how it got there logically. All great discoveries have involved such a leap. And then he makes a point. I believe that events in nature are controlled by a much stricter and closely binding law than we suspect today. This is still Einstein in a later work. When we speak of one event being the cause of another, our concept here is confined to one happening within one time section. It is dissected from the whole process. Our present rough way of applying the causal principle is quite superficial. That is, like what caused this paper to fall, right? What caused that paper to fall? Huh?
Yeah, it's not linear.
Well, that's what he's saying, but yeah, because the linear way of interpreting what caused this to happen, or what caused that pen to fall.
Gravity, not you.
Gravity, right? So the mechanism of gravity kicked in.
Yeah.
Because my hand, or you could say, oh, what caused it was my hand opened up that fast.
Yeah.
Or my arm moved this fast while it was in motion, right? I could give you any number of infinite choices and say that caused that.
Yeah.
But that's not what caused that.
That was your intention.
My intention. Right. So he says, we are like a child who judges a poem by its rhyme and not by its rhythm. Or we are like a juvenile learner at the piano, just relating one note to that which immediately precedes or follows. To an extent, this may be all very well when one is dealing with simple compositions, but it will not do for the interpretation of a Bach fugue. Quantum physics has presented us with a very complex process, and to meet them, we must further enlarge and refine our concept of causality. And finally, Max Planck wrote, science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature, and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. music and art are, to an extent, also attempts to solve, or at least express, that mystery. But to my mind, the more we progress with either, the more we are brought into harmony with all of nature itself. And that is one of the great services of science to the individual. So this, and there's a picture of Max Planck playing the piano, because Max Planck and Einstein made the point that whether they were at the blackboard or at the problem to solve, what would they do? Einstein writes profusely about this. He would go to his violin, he would play some Beethoven, and he would return back to the problem. Max Planck describes the same thing. Vernadsky, the great biogeochemist, is on the same path. You can find exact similar quotes by the Ukrainian biogeochemist when he's making his breakthroughs on the noosphere. Same time frame. And this is what LaRouche is saying when LaRouche says, the point is that the true expression of principles of science are actually those of classical artistic composition. And it's when you look at the world, your experience of it, through the ideas of classical tradition, and you see the progress in what is called the classical tradition, which goes to the function of the mind itself. It's the mind itself that is the subject. And it's the ability through the development of the mind that mankind is able to acquire higher orders of language, higher orders of physical science. Without classical art, that could never have existed. And this is what Kepler is doing with the harmonies of the spheres. The work that Planck cites profusely as being core. If anyone's going to understand the real scientific method, he cites Kepler all the time. You're looking at the question of the harmony in the external and the harmony in the internal world. And how do you form law based on that conception of man as a creative being and not a being that can be monetized? Or that's just, lives for his vices and virtues, or to maximize his vices and avoid pain. And so we got a big universe to discover, China's going for it, right? They've got a program where they're very ambitious right now, looking at the moon as a serious domain of human exploration and mining of helium-3. They've produced 2,000 fusion scientists in our university program. We don't even have fusion, and they're producing this many fusion scientists.
We don't even have science.
We don't even have science. we got climatology, which is not a very So what we got to do is think about what is the principle that these countries are increasingly tapping into about the nature of man that the oligarchy is afraid of and that Bertrand Russell hated. Because that is the point that we are going to have to discover, will discover, if we're going to make it to the next phase of our evolution. So I just leave it at that.
All right.
I
Put the
can't say
lights
an
on.
answer to them, but yeah.
This is less of a question, but I just want to say how apropos, appropriate this is right now, this presentation on this idea, especially considering the political situation, how fluid it is, how it's changing daily, and how easy it will be for the perception of a chaotic situation to come about. Never forget that whatever chaos has happened or does happen, it was thought about already. So it may appear chaotic, but it was already planned. So it can be fixed, and that's what we have to remember. I just want to make that statement.
Also that the oligarchy is crazy as hell and can unleash some chaos by their own stupidity. Which we also have to take that chaos factor of the oligarchy's own self-delusions into consideration. Oh yeah, if anybody, as we pass this around, people can throw in whatever later on, but yeah.
A question out of left field maybe. Do you see any relation between music and language?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, you could probably say that there would not be the development of any language if there hadn't been a musical impulse.
Well, poetry is really...
They say Italian is music of love. So if you want a love song, you use Italian language. Yeah. It's getting better.
Right.
They say that. You cannot, if you want to make a love song and put it in German, it would sound like shit.
I think you're getting into the phonetics of the language as opposed to the actual meaning, but yeah.
So
But no, I mean, overall, like, this is what Dante Alighieri was doing this when he was coming out with his, and I haven't read the whole thing, but from what it seems to be the case, when he was developing his work on language, he knew that there was no unified culture in Italy. There were all of these people speaking different dialects that couldn't communicate, so with no national language, you couldn't have a national policy of any sort that would liberate people from their serfdom. So Dante was a big outcast because he was of the upper strata, but he fought against them, right? As a politician, as an educational leader, and as a musician, he went and he fought to create works that would pull out the best, most beautiful qualities of all of the dialects. And he wrote his Commedia, and his Monarchia, and his De Linguistica, and all of these things he wrote that redefined the Italian language. And certainly, musicality was the core aspect of the whole investigation.
Can I suggest a book?
Yeah.
It's called How Music Really Works. And it describes fundamental principles of how to compose music. It might help you to shape your mind in here, because I found it tremendously useful. To let your mind just express itself in different ways. Like your mind acting on your mind.
Do you remember the author?
No, I don't.
Music?
It's called How Music Really Works.
How music really works.
What was the question?
The question was, well, this is a suggestion. There's a question on what is the role of language in music, and does language develop by music? And then the gentleman, what's your name? Charles, hi. Just mentioned that there was a book that you recommend called
How Music Really Works.
How Music Really Works, on just how
music
How
really
music
works.
really works.
Yeah, I can pick up the URL from Amazon.com and just forward to you.
But certainly the best way to actually study music is to play music and to sing. And one of the aspects of what LaRouche set up as part of the science curriculum, because our international movement does have a certain science curriculum working through the works of Plato, of Kepler, which are just a necessary component of creating an intelligentsia in society that could penetrate through the bullshit of what the oligarchy has created as a whole layer of fallacies that is our society, but also introduce a policy of leadership, right, that we could introduce strategic conceptions and policies that would allow us to break out of the current collapse trajectory. But one of those components is music, and we've got a serious musical, a lot of music work in a chorus in our full-time movement in Seattle, just a couple of hours away, which Robbie Scott, other people have talked about. They go down occasionally with Paul and work together with them, and increasingly people want to get a flavor of this thing. You should talk with Paul and see how you can also investigate the science of music by figuring out how you yourself are part of the course, and how do you harmonize your mind with a whole process to achieve a beautiful result, which is not the case for all music. But when you look at the people who, the musicians who think like scientists, like Bach, like Beethoven, Schubert, you look at those who have that quality of both balancing freedom and rigorous law together, where neither one is sacrificed, but there's a harmony of the two. You can find that in practicing their productions, that you yourself get more into their mind intuitively. And your intuition, that quality that's necessary for judging things morally and penetrating more deeply through logic is going to be enhanced in that process if you're doing them both together with an honest intention.
Yeah, well, we've been using the word chaos as a synonym for disorder, but as I understand it, chaos is sort of the border between disorder and order. It's a sort of dynamic boundary.
Yeah.
And the whole idea is that if you can embrace that, then you can achieve knowledge.
Sometimes you get lost in semantics, frankly. I don't want us to fall off the semantic boat or anything.
Someone I'm sorry, your name?
Francois.
Grant?
Francois.
Francois, I'm sorry. You brought up poetry, and poetry, I know LaRouche recently, or maybe not so recently, but I know he's talked a lot about poetry as well, in terms of communicating ideas, complex ideas, and through both music. You guys can probably.
The thing is that the human being is perceptions are actually organ. When you grow up, when you're a child, you're creating. You're creating. Anyway, this gets. That's going to go off the deep end. But anyhow, a concept is not something that you can communicate literally. That's the problem. And your concept that you have in your mind that you're trying to communicate to another person cannot be communicated literally, but you have to somehow get them to trigger in them the concept. And when you have literality, like the way people interpret the Bible or the Quran. The Quran's probably a different issue, but the way that people interpret the Bible literally means they're not getting the concept that's being created. And this, but now there was a great poet, one of the greatest English poets. His name is Shelley. Okay, and he wrote a book called In Defense of Poetry. And poetry is not meant to be literal in any way. If you think you know the meaning of the poem, then forget it. It's not a good poem.
Just be a description then. You need to have the gaps to like.
Yeah. But anyhow, but his book In Defense of Poetry is says that poets are the legislators of mankind. They are the true legislators of mankind through their poetry. So that's this whole idea of poetry and metaphor, is that you're actually using ambiguity and paradox to cause the mind to leap into a concept that comes into being because you've been posed with a problem that you have, with a complex problem you have to now make the jump. You make a jump into a conception, and that's where people get excited. You know, they have the aha moment, and that's what makes life interesting. But otherwise, it gets very boring. So,
but I say one thing that's a little weird about that too is because you're speaking literally. Oh, of course. You find it weird sometimes to find yourself needing to speak literally about poetry, which is needed. You need to do it, but it's a bit of an irony that you're speaking literally about what good poetry is supposed to be, right? But nonetheless, you got to read poetry and do it with an intention to figure out, well, what the hell does Percy Shelley want my mind to do, right? How do I tap into his intention when he's producing this metaphor, or this? There's something there, right?
Yeah. Like,
you don't just produce. Don't pretend, because a lot of people suppose it's flowery language. They want to, they want to sound nice, but go beyond that. And do the same thing with Planck, right? What is his intention when he's writing a work like this, or when he's making a discovery that can be described in this formulaic way? What's the immaterial intention behind the symbols? And you do with music too. So it's just like listen to some of this stuff, and actually, when you read a paper by LaRouche, for example, you're going to find a lot of references to all sorts of things you've probably never heard before. But you can go on YouTube and just listen to some of these things and see is what LaRouche saying about this actually make sense or not. Just do an honest investigation. Yeah.
You see, the main problem around the world these days is that now China becomes the main player, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many people understand China? Very few. None. When I was in, when my son studying in high school, I look at the history books, right? 550 pages, 55 pages.
Yeah.
How many pages are devoted to China? 10. How do you know China?
Yeah.
Now I can just tell you one thing about just using one word to describe China. Now we're talking about wars, right? The whole civilization is about war.
Yeah.
War means what in English? What does it mean? Plunder. Plundering. First thing that comes to mind. I get that, right? You know what's the Chinese way of defining war? Is in the language itself. It's as you say, a metaphoregram, a conceptogram, an ideogram, and a pictogram at the same time. It has two radicals. If you study Chinese, then you know why Chinese don't like war. You know why? because it starts with the word oneness and defense. Two sub-radicals. If you look at it, that means if you want to fight a war, you have to establish oneness, unite all everybody together. Now, how can you expect the Chinese to make war, to plunder? Before thought from the very beginning, if we want to fight a war, is to get everybody together.
To harmonize, to create harmony. Yeah.
Then, you have to understand China's concept 2,500 years ago, to have this concept, to fight for oneness. And after fighting oneness, what do you do? If you put the word rule, R-U-L-E, rule, it's a concept altogether. That means you have to fill up all the fragments together. Before you say like the warring states, they were into 7 states, right? After you get them together, the first ever China, you have to fill up all the gaps. That is rule. Rule means not to plunder everything. So the whole concept is different. And how many people understand it? In fact, I want to go to Harvard University, Cambridge University, and tell them, what do you mean by China? It's fighting a war. We are ashamed to die outside the country in the very beginning. How do you expect to fight outside? So these things alone already in our mind since 2,500 years ago. How can you say we are aggressive, we want to rule you? No way. Until this day, we still don't have vision.
Projection. Projection, yeah, it's total projection, yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Projection. Because they can't imagine how somebody else would think, other than the way they think. Yeah, that's the problem. Okay, yeah.
Since you're here, and the election is coming up, can you ask me about the federal election? I mean, the way I see it, NDP is like the best of the three.
30%. Look, man, I mean, you got to be creative about this thing because within the framework of what's being given to you to vote for, there's no solution to anything, really. And I'm not saying don't vote. I'm just saying you're going to have to introduce another variable in the form of your ability to organize, whether it's officials who want to run for election or whether it's union leaders or whatever, around the policies needed to join the BRICS, do Glass-Steagall, these things that we've been fighting for. And open up, things like the Arctic. Like, what's their view on accepting Russia's offer and China's offer to build Bering Strait? Most guys who are running for office don't even know that offer is on the table, or joining the AIIB or any of these other things. So, I mean, our job is to take it to that higher level, and there's no voting solution, simply. And yeah, you're probably going to find a little bit more rationality within the NDP party. You will find that, but don't have any vote for the party as a party.
The parallel between the U.S. and Canada is that the conservatives say they're pro-business, but they're for slavery. The Democrats say they're for development, but they're for green. So each of these parties, whether it's the NDP, or the Progressive Conservatives, or whether it's the Democrats, or the Republicans, their policies are internally self-contradicting and self-destructive. So how do you craft something out of that that's viable? And in the U.S., that's what our movement is trying to craft something that's viable. How that then plays into the Canadian situation remains to be seen. But it's a similar kind of paradox where you have the NDP trying to stop austerity, but they're for a different kind of austerity with the Greens. You have this other group saying they're anti-green. They're for development, but they're really not for development. They're for going to war with Russia. So it's a very problematic situation. So how do you come up from the top to intervene in such a way that you cause a process which yields a survivable result. And so in the upcoming elections in Canada, it's not clear, you know, it's not clear, but the voting part is secondary to the conceptual change that has to occur, and how do things break up and so forth and so on in that respect.
Yeah, you gotta break people intellectually out of the Bertrand Russell.
Under the control, yeah, under the control of
yeah.
And if you, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt took a racist party of the worst elements of the United States, because the Republicans had been taken over by Wall Street, and he turned it into a people's party when it wasn't the people. The Republican Party was the people, but he transformed it. But that racist element still remained inside the Democratic Party. See, so this is, you know, this is so you have a situation in Canada which is different, because Canada is a much different, it's got a different structure, and you know, we won't go into that at this point, but the point is that I don't see our movement getting behind a particular party at this, you know, at this point, because you know it's, I don't know what good that's going to do, you know, and if it's going to do any good.
Start a new one.
Huh?
Start a new project.
That's got to be an outlook, but it's not. Yeah, that's got to be an objective that we hold in our minds.
But do we have enough time to?
Well, here's the thing, right? It doesn't.
But we're so close.
Well, this is why the typical conventional political structures in which people expected change to happen is not the way things are going to be happening now. Things are happening completely off of the typical script. And
yeah, we're not on the script now, on the global scale. There's no script right now. The control is gone. Whatever comes out of this process comes out of this process. It's not predetermined at this point. It really, the emergence of the BRICS and everything else that's happening is not scripted at this point.
Certain things are, though, are they not? Like certain things, like as far as the like the Greek.
No, that's not scripted either at this point. That's why everybody's freaking out. Everything is up for grabs. It's not control. They're not in control, but then we're not in control either. So you're in a global dual power situation. I'm using old terms from the old days, good old days. You're in a global dual power situation now, emerging.
Two systems.
Between two different systems.
We're going to see a lot of things that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, you're going to see all
Complete
kinds of
different thing. You can never imagine what's going to come next.
Yeah, and we don't. Well, we know what we would like to see happen. We know what direction it should go in, and we have to communicate the conceptions that the conception. We have to communicate those conceptions to the proper you know, to the population, but more also to the people who are going to have to make
policy action.
Yeah,
and that's where the obligation gets a bit. This is the challenge that we should all feel, to say, well, can I properly represent and wield these conceptions in such a way that I can do that? Can I put myself in front of a grouping of diplomats or a grouping of elected officials and actually speak in such a way that I can, well, will I have something to say to them, first of all, right? Will I know what the hell to say to them and to develop them? Or am I not there yet? And if I'm not there, how do I have to figure out pathways to get to that place where I can do those things that I can't with my current capacities? So it requires some investment here, but again, time's not on our side either. You know?
So just to tie this back to Rob's question, specifically regarding Canada, would you say in the absence of new parties, hopefully temporary absence of new parties, to hopefully go a more correct direction, would be, if somebody was to vote, would you basically just vote for someone who has more of a potential to go the right way, which I guess at the moment is being seen as the NDP in Canada? If I wouldn't personally agree with the majority of what they're espousing.
Okay, you don't know that till just on the eve of you won't know, and you have to make that choice on your own. But the situation in Canada, the laws governing the creation of political parties have provisions in them that compromise that make you vulnerable to operations that could be run against you, against your party from the inside and the outside and everything else like that. The legal structure of forming a political party in Canada is such that it creates openings for external interventions and disruptions and can set you up legally for criminal prosecution if they want to. And we looked into the whole process of creating a political party. You're not really free. You are bounded by certain laws and financial reporting laws, and you essentially have elements that are not in your party have direct capabilities to legally disrupt your.
Well, I think without getting, yes.
Yeah, I don't want to get into details, but
something
the Canadian situation is very unique. That's all I gotta say.
Can you remember a source where we can go in and check out some of these things?
Look up how you form a political party.
Well, look,
But that's not, I'm not saying you should do that.
To get conceptual here,
But
we do know that in the future, the question is the future, right? Because this is what's, it exists, it's pulling us in the future, it's pulling us, like everything that's happening now is happening because of certain future conditions, but it's underdetermined. It's susceptible to intervention, to change.
Because you see, if we've got...
Again, this plays into the particle wave thing, right? Because it's a very good lesson in a sense to recognize that unlike the particle, or the light photon, we can choose our behavior in relation to the wave and amplify it in a way that our will and our judgment defines as being necessary based on the future where that wave is going. Now we know that the banking collapse and the structure of the derivatives web internationally has totally penetrated the Canadian credit unions, the banking system. We know that. We're one of the few people who do know that. We also have certain abilities to evaluate the physical destruction, physical economic destruction that we've subjected ourselves to for 40 plus years. We know those things too. We also have certain insights into nuclear policy, fusion policy afterwards. We have all sorts of capabilities that are makes us very rare, unique, important, and scary to the oligarchy because we have those, and we can teach them. And
So
I think that's how I think about that.
our approach is the field of ideas.
Yeah.
And creating an environment where people who come in here can take those ideas out to others who are also part of the field of ideas. And through that process, we intersect the other process which is going on, which is that the Canadian situation is governed by people, who are involved in the discussions behind the scenes that you don't see. But those discussions behind the scenes are the substance of what's going on, because the Canadian political system is opaque. It's not transparent in any way.
No.
And therefore, in a situation where there's no discussion in the population, and there's no discussion, open discussion, we create an open discussion. We create an open discussion so that there is an access to a process that otherwise is closed. And that if we can do that to any degree, it has a huge impact, but it's not visible. It's not a visible impact, except that somehow somebody comes forward with those ideas, and you say, well, those were the ideas that we were generating. But you did generate them, but I see this in many parts of the world where ideas that we've been beating these people over the head for 30 years, and all of a sudden they come forward with these ideas that we've been beating them over the head for 30 years with. So, so I mean, there's that aspect, that's what I'm saying, there's that aspect There's that aspect of it. So you're not, so it's the field of ideas, the field of discussion. You don't really affect things so much on a one-on-one, but you affect things through a field, through a process of discussion. And then this also intersects the blogosphere. This also intersects the discussion process, because where there is no discussion, there is, it's only where there's discussion that you have, it's what you introduce into the discussion, the dialogue, that is the key to the political process.
I mean, whatever the Canadian situation is, something is very obvious. I think I'm repeating what's obvious now. That the Conservatives have to go.
Right. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So that's a starting point. And whatever left now, we'll have to look at them and see what's going on. But I don't think the Conservatives...
No, I don't think there's a viability. I think...
voting Conservative is not an option.
I'll let you...
Yes, you have to take that out of...
But I don't want to take an official position at this time. I don't want it to be official, okay? I don't want to give you any recommendations officially, okay?
I want to add one comment to that. That the research, for example, that Matt has done in the creation of BC Hydro, for example, is illustrative of the nature of Canada. Canada was changed by WAC Bennett creating Hydro. Not only in BC, to become a more modern nation, a more modern economy, but in Quebec. And this was done against the imperialist forces in Ottawa. Now, this is the way Canada is kind of set up, as a confederalist federation. And I think this is the way that change is going to come in Canada, again.
And what you mean is the provinces versus federal.
Right.
Well, at this point, I would say in my investigations that in the context of the world that we had in that transition period in the 60s, I would say that that was the necessary path that it had to take. Based on the fact that the technocratic system hadn't ingrained itself in Quebec for 40 years yet, that only happened afterwards. And there was a certain, again, the context defines certain things that are appropriate,
Right.
Though truths and principles exist for all time. I think today, with the type of speedy change that the BRICS system is forcing upon the oligarchy in the world as a whole, I don't think it'll be that type, it won't take that form at this point of provinces going off doing their own thing, because there's been 40 years to set certain institutions of control in place since then. Not to say you shouldn't think about that at all, but I'm saying that that's not going to be the form it takes, I don't think, based on my research now. I think if anything, what you have with Chrétien showing up in Moscow, meeting with Putin, Jean Chrétien.
Right. Right.
4 weeks ago.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, at the height of the tension of the nuclear war, things like that are indicative of establishment decisions being made in the back rooms about what Canada's role is going to be. And in the context of the BRICS process increasingly becoming hegemonic, I think in that we can recognize that potentials here will open up to actually establish firm footings, to actually start acting like a real independent country. But that we don't have the culture for it on the one hand. If you think about there was this guy, Lazare Carnot of France, who said, it's better to have Republicans without a republic than a republic without Republicans. and that's...
Better to have what?
Better to have Republicans with no republic than a republic with no Republicans.
Okay.
So in a sense, it's like, how do you create that condition? It's a cultural, you have to give people a mission to start building something, develop a certain sense of skills, of a certain sense of usefulness. And the type of morality that naturally springs up when you start thinking about the future, and you start recognizing that you're part of a whole, that you're a useful part of a whole, not just somebody working in marketing. Bam, then you can start taking on deeper ideas that are necessary for a Republican self-governing society to flourish, which sadly, we're just not there yet, I mean, we've got to heal that cultural wound. And the science discussion, the music discussion, I think, are really wonderful flanks that we can bring to bear to give people a new variable, a new governing principle in their minds about what they're capable of doing that they never thought they would be capable of doing before. Yeah. And you're wise enough to know your material, but you have the creative spirit enough to think outside the box. You can discover laws of the universe and translate that back in ways that are both beautiful, that have expression in arts, have expression in science, and that's the technological improvement that allows us to have 7 billion people on Earth. And the oligarchy has been doing a lot of propaganda, as Paul went through, to get people to believe that the fact that we have 7 billion people on the Earth that can live much longer than we could have 3,000, 4,000 years ago in general, that's a sign that we're a virus. Most people would say, oh yeah, of course there's 7 billion people on the Earth. That's a sign why we're a virus. Don't you know that? No. What they're missing is that that is a shadow of a principle. The principle is not something you could see because that is the driver of what defines us as a human and not a monkey. Physically, we're not that different. DNA-wise, not that different. If you're going to try to make a materialist case for why we're different than animals, you won't go very far. Right? We got a bigger prefrontal cortex. We can lie better. Right? We play better video games because we have multiple thumbs. But if you get beyond that to a deeper species characteristic that we are able to discover how we think and think better about after having discovered that one assumption that we had was wrong and replace it with a better hypothesis that allows us to resolve paradoxes and translate that back to doing good for ourselves and our fellow man and find happiness in that process. If you can define human beings as that, the oligarchy, no oligarchy, whether it's Asian or European or whatever its flavor, will ever be able to sink its tentacles into human society. And the fact that Paul brought up the question of culture, well, he brought up this very important personality who you guys all have some disgusting literature in front of you named Bertrand Russell. And I'm assuming before people would be bad boys. And they start pulling up their charts and they start making an excuse or making arguments, very mathematical, logical arguments, that Africa is doing really great. Its business is up, the markets are up. If you would just look at the math, you'd think, well, there must be a renaissance. Things are so monetarily good based on the data sets that they're presenting. And it got me thinking in a discussion with him afterwards, we were playing with this irony that in our society, we pride ourselves in the West of having produced more PhDs per capita than in any other moment in our past. And yet, with all of those PhDs being pumped out of our society, out of our universities, the collapse of our civilization is happening at a faster and faster rate. Paradox. If the purpose of education is supposed to equip people with the mental capacities to solve problems, why the hell are we only making problems worse and worse? And it seems good people who seem to be, they kiss their child bed at night, they read them stories, they're a good neighbor, good father, good mother. Yet these people, as soon as they become PhDs and work for the World Bank, work as economists in most of the institutions, they seem to have a complete disconnect that the theories, the ivory tower formulas that they apply, kill millions, if not billions of people. There's a total disconnect between the theory, this abstract system of formula, and reality. There is generally not a very good connection. How is that the case? What are we doing wrong? And this is where the question of Bertrand Russell becomes very interesting from another angle. Because yes, as you recapitulated, mutually assured destruction, society of fear, divide to conquer, a balance of powers, that's been the last 60, 70 years, right? A total balance of terror. From the Soviets, from the Americans, the capitalists, you had the, what should Africa do to stop being so bad, right? And you go to this thing and there's certainly a few African diplomats there, but generally the whole thing is controlled by a bunch of detached white bureaucrats talking as experts about what Africa should do to be more behaved.
Ask me, I will let you know, because soon I'm going to run for president. Less than
okay. Well, see, here's the thing. What they started doing is they started pulling up a bunch of statistical graphs and stats and index charts pointing out, first they had a corruption index chart of the world, going through all of the most corrupt nations. Of course, Africa, Russia, China, very corrupt in the index chart of corruption. Canada, #1, not corrupt, 100% no corruption, right? Great Britain, no corruption. And of course, they're giving these charts as a way to just somehow they're mathematical, entirely mathematical, right? As if you could measure corruption or inequality by a mathematical metric, as if that were possible, but they do it anyway. And then they use that as a way to morally say, this is why we can tell them how much carbon they have to reduce, how much they have to obey to international standards of good governance. Now, I don't know if they've ever looked at what exactly Harvard does in the back rooms or what the Privy Council does in Canada, but I think that would change their charts a little bit. A professor gets up afterwards, who's from Nigeria, and he begins his presentation by saying, I'm going to be declaring war on mathematics. He's being provocative. He's not saying he hates mathematics. He gives an anecdote of one of his invitations to participate in a World Bank summit meeting. A World Bank meeting on African culture. He was supposed to be a representative to speak as an authority on African culture. And he said, as soon as I got there, I saw a bunch of IMF, World Bank economists all sitting together talking about Africa, and I knew it was The reason why I said it was a very good bridge between what Paul said and what I'm about to say, no. I will want that. Is because the empire controls through divide and conquer. What we're discovering now, arising with the BRICS through the leadership of China, and especially the China-Russia-India nexus, is that the new paradigm that's defining their mode of internal and foreign policy is based on an approach of a harmony of interests. Right? The idea of a win-win. Win-win situation. Exactly. And this is what's really freaking out a lot of the imperialists that have been controlling the different mechanisms of our geopolitical society for the past century. And up until now, it's largely been understood only by a few that the means by which we communicate across cultures, across languages, and get above our empirical, physical differences, which is cultural, this person different language, religion than me, they speak different, language than me, they speak different, they worship different named God than I do. We have to fight. That's what the British have been inflaming for many, many centuries. The reason why, the way we get over this is through the universal language of both science and music. Right? Because no matter what language you are, no matter what culture you are, you can discover that we're made of atoms, you can discover that we're in a galaxy, and you can discover its principles and apply them for the benefit of your people, if you're being creative. If you're not following any formulas that tell you you have to think this way and you can't break out of those formulas, if you don't believe that, God, they already have an idea of who Bertrand Russell was. So? Yeah? Okay. Mr. LaRouche, the gentleman we worked with, was a 93-year-old physical economist, a candidate for the presidency of the American Republic on 8 occasions, and an advisor to international governments, has made the point on a number of occasions, which people find very troubling, that Bertrand Russell is the most qualifies as being the most evil man of the 20th century, which is controversial because, as Paul went through, this is the big peacemaker. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's the guy who fought throughout the 60s to create the anti-nuclear movement, right? To ban the bomb and all of these things. So how the hell is a guy who's apparently a logician?
For literature, do you know the book? It was a special book for the entire activity.
I'll get back to you on that one. He did write prolifically. But Bertrand Russell's ghost doesn't just infest our society in the form of a fear of thermonuclear annihilation, being it that he was one of the co-architects of the mutually assured destruction doctrine. It goes deeper than that as well. That's one important aspect. And I'm going to touch in my presentation on another aspect, and I'm going to do it in a way that utilizes the writings of a certain scientist and a philosopher and a musician named Max Planck. Before I do that, though, I want to start with a quick anecdote because, and this is going to get at how the ghost of Bertrand Russell's mind still infects and controls and distorts our society today. Christine and myself were at a little while ago. We were at a conference called Africa 2063. It's one of these conferences in Ottawa held by the public service, or the government of Canada.